Hey everybody. Before we begin this week's show, we wanted to invite you to support the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network, or PanCAN. PanCAN has an upcoming cancer walk called PanCAN Purple Stride on April 27th, 2024. You can find a walk in your area on their website, which we will put in the show notes. You can also make a financial donation. Several people associated with Star Trek are involved in fundraising for this organization, including Jonathan Frakes, who played the great Commander Riker in The Next Generation, and Armin Shimmerman, who played everybody's favorite Ferengi bartender, Quark, in Deep Space Nine. PanCAN supports research to improve early detection and accelerated treatment and provides personalized support and resources to those who have been affected by pancreatic cancer. Please consider joining Team Trek and making a financial donation. This is a cool way for the Star Trek community to come together for a worthy cause. We will leave the link to the Team Trek fundraising page in the show notes, or you can go to pancan.org for more information. And now, enjoy the episode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Father and Son's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm your host, Ethan.
And I'm your co-host, Anthony. And today we're going to do something a little bit different. The last 3 episodes, we've talked about an episode of Star Trek The Original Series and our thoughts on those episodes and so forth. But today we thought we'd give you the opportunity to get to know us a little bit better and to talk about why we love Star Trek. And so I'm going to ask Ethan some questions as we go because I think his perspective is particularly interesting. Ethan's 15 years old, and it's interesting to get his perspective from his generation about this iconic show that's meant so much to so many people for so many decades. So let's start off, and let me ask you, Ethan, what was your initial impression of Star Trek when we first watched an episode or a movie together?
First initial impression, I have to think about this one. I don't know, I think it was in elementary school the first time we ever watched Star Trek, and I think it was probably one of the original series movies, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that the first movie we watched together was Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. And then I think we watched Star Trek 3 and 4 and 5 and maybe 6. We never got into the Next Generation movies, but that was your first exposure, was to the crew from the original series, but the movies, not the TV show.
Right. I'm kind of remembering now, because I remember the first time I watched the one with the whales. That was an interesting movie.
Yeah, the one with the whales.
We're not even going to call it Star Trek 4, it's just Star Trek, the one with the whales.
Good. So, did you like it? Did you have any? I mean, you've always liked action type movies and science fiction. You love Star Wars, which we've watched a lot of Star Wars together. But what did you think of Star Trek when you were younger and we watched those movies?
When I was younger, I think I just liked it because you liked it. Honestly, didn't really have an opinion on it. I was like, oh yeah, Dad loves Star Trek. I'm gonna watch Star Trek with him. And then I remember we tried to watch some of The Next Generation as a family, but we never really did. We kind of all lost interest in it.
Right. Yeah. Your mom and your sisters were not real into it. And so it didn't really take off as a family show that we could enjoy together. So fast forward several years to about probably a year ago, maybe a little bit more, I was watching Star Trek. I think I was starting to watch The Next Generation, and I was trying to get you to watch some shows with me, and you made a comment to me that I thought was hilarious, which was, it's just a bunch of people sitting in chairs and talking. And of course, Star Trek is so much more than that, as you now know, but from the perspective of however old you were, 13 or 14-year-old, I thought that was pretty funny, although I was disappointed because I was hoping that I could get you into it like I had done with Star Wars. But eventually, I got you to sit down and watch Strange New Worlds, the pilot episode for Star Trek Strange New Worlds. I had watched it and I was really impressed with it. And I knew that visually, aesthetically, it probably would be a lot more welcoming to your eyes since you've grown up with this amazing CGI and technology that we didn't have when I was growing up. And so I thought maybe that would be enough to at least get you to watch it. And then hopefully the story would pull you in. And so we sat down one night and we watched the pilot episode of Strange New Worlds. And what was your initial thought after watching that episode?
Well, before we watched it, I remember there was a bit of convincing required to get me to watch it. There was a bit of discussion between you and me. You're like, come on, just give it a chance. And I was like, I gave it a chance however so long ago, 7-ish years ago. I don't remember the specifics. But then we watched the episode and I was like, this isn't too bad.
What did you like about it, just in general?
Now I kind of need to remember the Strange New Worlds pilot episode a bit. Right, I didn't really know any of the characters on the Enterprise. I knew who Spock was at the very least. But I still found it it was an entertaining episode because, right, I'm starting to remember the Enterprise was sent on a rescue mission on a planet that was not warp capable. And so they kind of needed to follow the Prime Directive and do that. And I was like, wow, this is pretty cool science fiction stuff. I was like, I'll give it a little bit more of a chance after a few episodes.
Yeah, and then it sucked you in, right? And we were hooked on Strange New Worlds. And then I think, if I remember right, we started watching Star Trek Discovery after that, which we have some mixed feelings about Star Trek Discovery. The first season was pretty good. The second season was quite good. And then the last few seasons haven't been up to par, although I hear that this upcoming season is supposed to be pretty good. This will be the final season of Star Trek Discovery that will be released later this year, and that is hopefully going to go back to the storytelling that they did in the first couple of seasons that made it a pretty good show. But I think that was the next show we watched, and then eventually we started watching Star Trek Deep Space Nine together. And that one we're now almost to the end of season 5, and we've watched every episode up until that point together. And that's kind of your introduction, if you will, to old school Star Trek. You've watched some of the episodes of Next Generation with me, and some episodes of Voyager, which I'm going through right now. But Deep Space Nine was kind of your introduction to Star Trek from my generation.
Yeah, if I'm being totally honest, until we started watching it, I thought Deep Space Nine was a movie, and I thought we were watching a movie that night.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's funny. I didn't know that. So, it's interesting. So you thought the pilot episode was a movie, and when did you realize that it was actually a TV show?
It was before we started watching it, but we were finding something to watch that night, and you were like, hey, we should try watching Deep Space Nine. That might be a good show. And I was like, wait, that's not a movie?
Okay.
I mean, just by looking at like the little like cover art that showed the space station, in my mind, it looked like a movie cover.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it kind of sounds like a movie, right? Star Trek Deep Space Nine. So.
Yeah, it does sound like a movie.
Cool. And so what did you think of Deep Space Nine in particular as we delved into Star Trek from the 1990s?
From what I've seen, Deep Space Nine was incredibly different. Not just in, obviously, its graphics and, like, just, you know, quality of the film that it took. Just the whole story was different because it was essentially it was about a captain of a starship being brought onto a space station in pretty much the middle of nowhere. And one thing I found really interesting was the whole Cardassian Bajoran culture in the first episode, because I was confused because they're letting the Cardassians onto the station after a war. That's weird. And they're just visibly hated, but they're just spending their time there.
Right. Yeah, they had signed a treaty or come to some sort of agreement to end the conflict and the occupation, right? Yeah, and Deep Space Nine is an interesting show because it was serialized, and in the 1990s, this was kind of new and an unconventional way to shoot a TV show. And so Deep Space Nine has this story arc that continues through the entire series, right? With the Dominion War and the, starts off with the end of the Bajoran and Cardassian conflict, and then the characters develop, and they have one-off episodes every so often, but a lot of the times the episodes are tied together. And that was a pretty progressive approach to TV at the time. Now, eventually, and in your lifetime, that becomes the norm in TV shows, right, is the serialized storytelling. But Deep Space Nine was unique at that point in terms of its storytelling. So I wonder if that may be something that made you more interested in Star Trek, just because you're used to that serialized type of show versus the Next Generation, where they might have an episode or two or three that have a story arc, but for the most part, they're individual one-off episodes. Do you think that had any influence in your eventual love of Star Trek?
That I wasn't really thinking about it like that when I was watching Star Trek, but as we've started watching the original series, I've definitely noticed no episodes are connected. And sometimes when we've been watching Deep Space Nine, it feels like the episodes aren't connected, and at the same time they are connected, because then one episode somebody goes through some deep traumatic event, next episode they're walking around like everything's fine.
Yeah.
Like a close person to them might have died in that episode that we were pretty much introduced to for like 20 minutes. They're distraught the whole episode. Next episode, no problem. It's like nothing happened.
Right. And I think that's because this idea of the serialized storytelling in TV over multiple episodes was groundbreaking. It was new. And so the character development from episode to episode doesn't always feel like it's a serialized show. But the narrative does, right? Because most of the episodes touch on this, this story about the wormhole and their access to the Gamma Quadrant, and then the rise of the Dominion and the conflict that's coming. And we're getting to the Dominion War here soon. It's already kind of started where we're at in the series. But I can totally see what you're saying, that episode to episode, in terms of the characters, there may not have been as much continuity as we would maybe expect today in a well-done TV show.
Yeah, there's also kind of just characters that completely forget about. Like in the first season of Deep Space Nine, they brought like the Bajoran religious leader with them to the Gamma Quadrant, and they kind of had to leave her like marooned on a planet, because if she left the planet, she would die. But nobody's ever talked about it. They kind of just forgot about it.
Yeah.
Maybe brought it up for the episodes where they were re-electing the new Kai, or whatever the title is called. But other than that, nobody talks about it ever again.
Yeah, they just kind of forgot about that storyline. And
they gave the title to the most evil lady in all of Star Trek.
Right, Kai Wynn. So now that you've had quite a bit of exposure to Star Trek, including now the original series, which we're talking about on this podcast, what is it that you enjoy or love about the Star Trek idea, the Star Trek universe?
I think when it comes to the Star Trek universe, I really love just the exploration aspect of it. I mean, that's what Starfleet's built on. But that's probably my favorite part of it, because it's finding new things in civilization and life that's incredibly interesting, and the fact that they managed to tie it all in to stuff you see today is incredibly fascinating. But then there's also the cool dynamic action scenes, especially the newer stuff has really good fight scenes, mainly because the ships can actually move around a bit and are not stuck on a straight line firing a little phaser blast. But like it's all the action and all the exploration, basically what makes Star Trek Star Trek.
Yeah. When I was your age and I loved Star Trek from a pretty early age because I think I've mentioned this before. My parents exposed me to the movies that were made in the 70s and 80s with Captain Kirk and Spock. And then eventually they started selling the original series on VHS. And my dad would collect those episodes. And so I would watch some of those episodes from time to time. But that's the thing that I loved about Star Trek 2 was this idea of exploration and space as the final frontier, which it really is the final frontier, right? And this idea that we could boldly go where no one has gone before and find strange new worlds and, alien life and different cultures. It was just a really exciting thing to me. And quite frankly, I'm a little disappointed because I thought at the time that I was your age growing up in the 80s and 90s, in my mind, I would have thought that by now in 2024, we would have been much further along in our exploration of space. Not necessarily to Star Trek levels and, going warp speed and that kind of stuff. But I would have thought we would have made it to Mars and maybe even had a colony there or a colony on the moon. And we're working towards that, right? We've got SpaceX and what's the Jeff Bezos company? I can't remember. There's a couple of these companies from these billionaires. Richard Branson, I think, has a space company. And so that's the goal, right? I think Elon Musk's company is probably the one that's made the most progress towards that. But we're not as far along as I had anticipated we would be by now. So it is a little disappointing. But that idea of exploration resonated with me as a young man. So that's interesting that's kind of what stands out to you, too. What else? Anything else that you love about Star Trek?
Well, before that, I just want to say, didn't everybody from the 80s have that kind of vision for the future? I mean, Back to the Future, too. They had everyone on hoverboards and self-tying shoes and auto-adjusting clothes. But no, we're still walking around and tying our own shoes.
Yeah, I think to some extent that's definitely true. In probably the mid to late 70s, 1980s, there was this kind of expectation that technology would advance beyond our wildest imagination. And in some ways it has, right? Because the idea of the internet, what the internet is today, with the web and cloud computing and having smartphones and the access to information about literally anything you can think of in the palm of your hand, that wasn't something that we necessarily imagined at the time, right? I mean, probably some visionary thinkers did, but as a general rule, the population didn't think about that kind of technology advancing in the way that it has. But to your point, I think that there was this idea of a future that would be, advanced in technology and that we would be doing things that we couldn't even dream of at the time. One of the things that I have come to really love and appreciate about Star Trek is the characters. And I think in addition to the idea of Star Trek and exploration and all that, I think the characters are what make Star Trek truly great, because you have to have great characters to have great storytelling, right? And Star Trek, as a general rule, is great storytelling, or at least really good storytelling. Now, not every episode is amazing, right? And I think I heard Jonathan Frakes say one time that, when you're doing 26 episodes a season, not every episode is going to be a home run. But as a general rule, the Star Trek stories in the TV shows and the movies have been pretty awesome. But the characters are the key to those stories working, right? And so
Right.
I love the diversity of the characters, the way that different cultures are explored in Star Trek, and I love how Star Trek places these species with wildly different cultures and ideas and philosophies into the same story, onto the same starship, and they learn how to work together, right?
Right.
They learn what it means to become a team and to have a common purpose and to work for the betterment of the galaxy. And I love that ideal. I just think it's a really cool, beautiful ideal that is worth striving for in humanity. And Star Trek reflects that ideal through its diverse characters.
Yeah, I would definitely say the same to that. Just especially the way that kind of older Star Trek did it in their character development. You found just a connection with these characters, almost kind of like you were there witnessing it, just kind of observing rather than influencing. One thing I did notice is the way they do character development now, like on Star Trek Discovery. It's almost to a point where almost I could care a little less about their backstory. And I think that's because I've noticed this for characters like Major Kira on Deep Space Nine. Their backstories are tied into the episode.
Yeah.
Like, often there will be in those backstory episodes some kind of like a person from the resistance coming back or some old threat during the Cardassian occupation. Things like that would happen, and you'd really begin to appreciate the backstory of the character. But on more modern television, the characters in Star Trek Discovery, they kind of just brought up their backstory at the most randomest of times. And I think it's really difficult to remedy that situation, seeing as the writers put them, what was it, 10,000 years in the future, 100,000?
Yeah, I don't remember, but
I don't
it's
know.
it's
It was
like,
a long time.
It's a long time in the future. Yeah, when they
Nobody from their past is alive. So, yeah, it's really hard to do their character development there.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. I hadn't thought of that, but I think you're right. They don't, in Star Trek Discovery, at least, they haven't done a great job of integrating the backstory of the characters into the episode arcs and the storyline for the season. And that has made some of the characters in Star Trek Discovery not quite as charismatic or interesting as the characters in other Star Trek series have been. And that's unfortunate, but I think you're right on with that. Now, they do have some good characters in Discovery. The what's the first officer's name?
Oh, it's Saru.
Saru, yeah, Saru. He's a good character.
Yeah, because they did a whole episode about his planet, and so you kind of got sucked into the sort of Kelpian backstory about how they're fearing. There was the secondary species on the planet that aren't as strong, but they had technology, and so they kind of just overwhelmed them by force. And the whole storyline that the thing that the Kelpians think are causing them to die is actually just part of their life cycle and makes them stronger in a way. Like, that was really interesting. But one thing I didn't like is there were characters introduced, especially in the end of season 2, that you would have only known existed if you would watch those Star Trek shorts.
Right.
Which we didn't. So there was parts that left me very confused.
Yeah. Definitely in terms of Star Trek storytelling, Star Trek Discovery's on the lower end. Now, we've never watched together Star Trek Enterprise, and that is kind of like the redheaded stepchild of Star Trek. I've watched some episodes of that some years ago. It's okay. It's not bad, but I when we get to that eventually, I'll be interested to hear your take on Star Trek Enterprise, because it's quite different, and it takes place before the Captain Kirk and Spock era. So it's a prequel, and it only lasted a few seasons, I think. It wasn't particularly popular. But nonetheless, as a general rule, Star Trek's characters are really, really compelling and important to the stories, and you become emotionally invested in the characters, right? So think of, for me, like I think about my favorite characters. Of course, I love the captains. I love Captain Kirk and Captain Picard and Captain Janeway. I think they're all, amazing, strong leaders, and make for good characters. But probably more than those characters, I like the kind of secondary characters, like Worf in The Next Generation, right? This Klingon who was raised by humans, who ends up in Starfleet after the Klingon Federation conflict, and culturally he's still trying to adapt, and he's still trying to connect with his own culture, his own Klingon culture, right? And it just makes for really interesting storytelling with characters like that.
Yeah, and especially with characters like that, like I feel like most Star Trek shows and things and movies like that have a Mr. Spock style character who's kind of out of the loop on social norms, emotional stuff. Like Next Generation has Mr. Worf, who is just very out of the loop on most human aspects. Star Trek Voyager introduces Seven of Nine, who is just completely oblivious and thinks like if anything socially related is just not useful. And yeah, I've noticed a pattern for things like that. Like Deep Space Nine has Odo too, who, they're all just very underdeveloped characters, but they do that on purpose just to provide some contrast.
Right.
You kind of see what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah, kind of introverted characters in a way. And you're right about having a Spock character on most of these shows too. Like Data in Next Generation is really the Spock character, right?
Right. I kind of forgot about Data for a moment there.
And he's a fascinating character, but he wasn't a replica of Spock, right? He didn't play it like Spock, but he's still this highly intelligent, logically thinking android who is trying to understand what it means to be human, right? And you get so many interesting stories and funny episodes and thought-provoking ideas that come as a result of those characters like Spock and Data, and even the Doctor in Voyager, who's a hologram, right, is trying to find his humanity in this process, right?
Right.
He's a computer program. He has these computer subroutines that make him what he is, but it raises the question of what does it mean to be human, and what kind of things need to happen to be able to connect to our human nature, so to speak.
Right. And it can also provide some incredibly funny moments. Like, probably one of my favorite funny Star Trek quotes is when Worf questions Odo and asks, "Why are you talking to your beverage?"
Right. Yeah.
Because he has no social cues, and he's just, if I see something weird, I'm going to question it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this has been an interesting discussion, and like I said, I always enjoy getting your perspective and hearing what your thoughts are, especially on the older Star Trek stuff. And so we'll continue to offer our generational perspectives in this podcast, and as we continue to explore Star Trek, the original series, episode by episode. But we'll also do some of these topical episodes from time to time where we just kind of riff on Star Trek, or even just science fiction in general, or other shows that we might be interested in, or stories that we might love, so just to keep it interesting. So we appreciate everybody that's listening to the podcast. And if you like it, we would love to get a 5-star rating and a positive review. That will help us be able to spread the word, get the word out about the podcast, and hopefully gain more listeners over time as we continue creating content.
Yeah, and if you have any suggestions, leave them down in a comment. If you want to check out our socials, we'll leave them down in the description. But for now, that's all we've got for you. So we'll see you in the next one.
All right. Take care, everyone.